Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I called the alien hacker group on the dark web. Two men in black suits showed in front of my door. This is the kind of thing I would normally keep to myself, but I need to get this off my chest. So here it goes, Reddit. About a month ago, I was bored and curious, and I stumbled upon a thread discussing an alien hacker group on the dark web. I know it sounds like bullshit, but I promise you, this is real. My name is Nick, and I've always been a tech junkie. I spend hours in front of my computer, tinkering with code, exploring the deepest recesses of the internet, always looking for something new and thrilling. One night, I came across this forum discussing the alien hacker group. It was said they had tech way beyond our understanding, that they could access anything, anywhere. They could control minds, see through walls, even manipulate time. It was the kind of stuff you'd expect from a bad sci-fi movie, but the testimonials seemed genuine. Curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself diving deeper into the rabbit hole. After hours of sifting through forums and obscure websites, I found a contact, an email address, nothing more. I hesitated, staring at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. But the idea of accessing such power was too tempting. I sent a message. The next day, I got a response. It was a simple reply. "We have noticed you. Expect a visit." I thought it was a joke, some kind of prank, but there was something about that message that made my skin crawl. It was too precise, too knowing. I brushed it off and went about my day, but the unease lingered. 2 nights later, around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud knock on my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled out of bed and looked through the peephole. Standing there were 2 men in black suits. They looked like they had stepped out of a Men in Black movie, complete with dark sunglasses, despite it being the middle of the night. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called out, asking who they were. One of them responded in a voice that sounded almost robotic. "We are here to discuss your recent inquiry." My blood ran cold. How the hell did they find me? I didn't give out any personal information. My heart raced as I tried to think of a way out. Then the strange things started happening. My phone began to ring, but when I looked at it, the caller ID was just a series of symbols and numbers that made no sense. The TV in the living room turned on by itself, flickering between static and strange images that I couldn't make out. I felt like I was losing my mind. The men outside continued to knock, their persistence growing more intense. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I grabbed my laptop and tried to find anything, any clue about what was happening. But my internet connection was dead. My phone wouldn't make calls, and the TV continued its eerie flicker. Suddenly, my laptop screen went black, and a message appeared. "We are here to help you. Open the door." My hands trembled as I read the words. I felt trapped, like a rat in a cage. Desperation took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the door frame creaking under the pressure. Then the door flew open, and the 2 men stepped inside. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, almost like they were gliding rather than walking. One of them reached out, and before I could react, I felt a sharp pain in my neck. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was strapped to a metal table in a room that looked like something out of a nightmare. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with the scent of chemicals. The men in black suits were there, watching me with their emotionless eyes. "Welcome," one of them said, his voice still carrying that robotic tone. "You have been chosen." I struggled against the restraints, panic setting in. "Chosen for what?" I demanded. "To witness the truth," he replied. "The truth about our existence, about the universe. You sought us out, and now you will see." Before I could respond, a blinding light filled the room, and I felt my mind being torn apart. Images flashed in before my eyes, too fast to comprehend. I saw worlds beyond our own, beings that defied explanation, and a darkness so deep it swallowed everything. When the light finally faded, I was back in my apartment. The men in black were gone, and everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. I had seen things that no human was meant to see, and I could feel them watching me. Even now, I don't know what they did to me, but I haven't been the same since. I see things, hear things. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, my body covered in strange marks that I can't explain. My phone and computer act on their own, showing me glimpses of that other world, that other reality. I tried to go to the police, but they didn't believe me. They said I was hallucinating, that I needed help. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. And I know that those men, those beings, are still out there watching, waiting. So please, if you ever come across anything about the alien hacker group, stay away. Don't make the same mistake I did, because once they have you in their sights, there's no escaping. And the things they show you, the things they do to you, there's no coming back from that. I just hope that by sharing this, I can warn others, maybe save someone from the nightmare I'm living. But even as I type this, I can feel them. They're close. So if I disappear, you'll know why. After that night, things got worse. The images I had seen, the sounds I heard, they stayed with me, haunting my every waking moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. My apartment felt like a prison, each creak and shadow sending chills down my spine. I tried to return to my normal routine, but it was impossible. My job, my friends, even my family, they all noticed something was off. I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain that I had contacted an alien hacker group, and now I was being tormented by mysterious men in black suits? They would think I was insane. One night, I was sitting at my computer, trying to distract myself with some mindless browsing, when my screen flickered and went black. I felt my stomach drop. The same message appeared again. "We are here to help you. Open the door." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at the door. The same dread washed over me, but I couldn't ignore it. I needed answers. Slowly, I got up and approached the door. I could see shadows moving under the crack, and I felt like a deer in the headlights. This time, when I opened the door, only one man stood there. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes were piercing. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The air around him felt colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We are the keepers," he replied, his voice a low monotone. "You have been chosen for a reason." "Chosen for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" He looked at me, and for a moment I felt a deep, indescribable sorrow. "To show you the truth," he said. "But the truth comes at a price. I didn't know what he meant, but before I could ask, he reached out and touched my forehead. I felt a jolt of electricity surge through me, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a different place. It was a vast white room with no windows or doors. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint light, and I could hear a low hum that vibrated through my bones. I was not alone. There were others, all of them looking just as confused and terrified as I was. "Where are we?" I asked a woman standing next to me, but she just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the humming grew louder, and a figure appeared in the center of the room. It was not human. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes were huge and black. It had no mouth, yet I could hear its voice in my head. "Welcome," it said. "You have been brought here to witness the truth of our existence. You are the chosen few who will spread our message to your kind." The images came again, but this time they were clearer. I saw worlds being consumed by darkness, entire civilizations destroyed in an instant. I saw beings that defied all logic and reason, creatures that made my blood run cold. And then I saw Earth, our planet, engulfed in flames. "We have been watching you," the voice continued. "Your kind is on the brink of self-destruction. We are here to guide you, to show you the way to salvation." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. The images burned into my mind, searing themselves into my memory. I felt a deep, overwhelming despair. These beings, these keepers, they were not here to help us. They were here to control us, to bend us to their will. "We will return you to your world," the voice said. "You will remember everything. You will spread our message. And when the time comes, you will join us." Before I could react, the room dissolved around me, and I was back in my apartment. The man in the black suit was gone, and everything looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. I could still hear the humming in my head, feel the images burning behind my eyes. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and paranoia, but the marks on my body, the strange symbols etched into my skin, told a different story. They were real, and they were a constant reminder that I was not alone. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to carry on with my life, but the nightmares persisted. The visions grew more frequent. I started seeing the men in black suits everywhere. They were always just out of sight, watching, waiting. One night, I was jolted awake by a loud noise. It sounded like something was trying to break into my apartment. I grabbed the kitchen knife again and crept towards the noise. The air was thick with tension, and I could barely breathe. As I turned the corner, I saw them. 2 men in black suits, standing in my living room. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at me with their cold, emotionless eyes. I backed away, but they followed, their movements smooth and precise. "We are here to remind you," one of them said. "You cannot escape your destiny." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and everything went black again. When I woke up, I was lying on my kitchen floor, the knife still clutched in my hand. The men were gone, but their words echoed in my mind. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. The lines between the real world and the nightmare are blurring, and I don't know what to do. If anyone out there is reading this, please heed my warning. Stay away from the dark web. Stay away from the alien hacker group, because once they have you, there's no escaping, and the truth they show you is more terrifying than any horror you can imagine. It's been a month since my last encounter with the men in black suits. I've tried everything to go back to my normal life, but it feels like I'm living on borrowed time. Sleep is a distant memory. Every time I close my eyes, I see those otherworldly images, hear the haunting voice of the keeper, and feel the cold touch of the men in black. The symbols etched into my skin haven't faded. If anything, they've become more prominent, almost as if they're glowing faintly under my skin. I have taken to wearing long sleeves all the time to hide them, but I can still feel their presence, a constant reminder of what I've become a part of. Last night, things took a darker turn. I was sitting at my computer, trying to distract myself with some coding projects, when my screen flickered and went black. The same message appeared, but this time it was different. The time is near. Prepare yourself. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and a low humming filled the silence. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. The caller ID was a series of random symbols again. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaking. "Nick, it's time," a voice said. It was the same robotic tone as the men in black suits, but it felt more urgent, more commanding. "We are coming for you." I dropped the phone and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The humming grew louder, and I felt a strange pressure building in my head. I tried to ignore it, but it was like trying to ignore a screaming alarm. I stumbled towards the door, desperate to get out, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the living room. I turned to see my TV had fallen off its stand, the screen cracked and flickering with static. The symbols from my skin were now displayed on the screen, moving and shifting like a living thing. Then I saw them, the two men in black suits, standing in the reflection of the TV screen. Their faces were obscured, but their presence was undeniable. I could feel their eyes on me, piercing through the screen. "Nick," one of them said, his voice echoing through my mind. "You cannot run from us. Accept your fate." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and I felt a sharp pain in my head. It felt like my skull was being split open. The last thing I remember is collapsing on the floor, the symbols from the TV burning into my eyes. When I woke up, I was in a dark room. The walls were cold and metallic, and the air smelled of antiseptic. I was strapped to a metal table again, but this time there were other people around me, all of them strapped down, their eyes wide with fear. I struggled against the restraints, but they were too tight. Panic set in as I realized I was back in that place, the place where the keepers had shown me their horrific visions. A low humming filled the room, and a bright light flashed overhead. The same gray, sickly figure appeared, its black eyes fixed on me. "You cannot escape your destiny, Nick," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. "You are one of us now." I wanted to scream, to fight, but I was powerless. The images came again, more vivid and terrifying than before. I saw people being torn apart, their screams echoing through the void. I saw cities crumbling, consumed by darkness. I saw myself, standing among the keepers, my eyes black and soulless. "We are coming," the keeper said, "and you will help us." Before I could respond, the light flashed again, and I was back in my apartment. The room was dark, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I was drenched in sweat, my body trembling. The symbols on my skin were burning, and I could feel them pulsing with a strange energy. I knew then that there was no escaping this. The keepers had marked me. and they were using me for their own purposes. I was a pawn in their game, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Desperation drove me to the edge. I needed answers, needed to know what they wanted from me. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for anything that could help me. I delved deeper into the dark web, looking for any mention of the Keepers, the alien hacker group, anything that could give me a clue. I found a thread buried deep in an obscure forum. It was filled with stories similar to mine, people who had encountered the Keepers and had been marked. They spoke of the same symbols, the same visions, the same feeling of being watched. One post stood out. It was from someone who claimed to have escaped, who had found a way to break free. They talked about a ritual, a way to sever the connections into the Keepers. It sounded insane, but I was willing to try anything. I gathered the items they mentioned: candles, salt, a mirror, and a piece of paper with the symbols drawn on it. I set everything up in my living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The instructions were clear. Light the candles, create a circle of salt, and stare into the mirror while chanting the symbols. I followed the instructions to the letter. As I chanted, the air grew colder and the humming returned. The symbols on my skin burned brighter, and I felt a strange energy pulsing through me. I stared into the mirror, my reflection warping and shifting. For a moment, I thought it was working. The humming grew louder, and the symbols seemed to fade. But then, the mirror shattered, and I was thrown back by an unseen force. I hit the wall hard, my head spinning. When I opened my eyes, the men in black suits were standing over me. Their faces were cold and emotionless, their eyes filled with a strange dark light. "You cannot escape," one of them said. "You are ours." I felt a cold hand on my forehead, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone in my living room. The candles burnt out and the salt scattered. The symbols on my skin were still there, burning brighter than ever. I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried everything, and nothing works. The Keepers are coming, and I can't stop them. I can feel them getting closer, their presence growing stronger. If anyone out there is listening, please stay away from the dark web. Don't seek out the alien hacker group, because once they have you, there's no escaping. And the things they do to you, the things they show you, are more terrifying than you can imagine. I'm not sure how much longer I have. I can feel them watching me, waiting for the right moment. If I disappear, you'll know why. And if they come for you, remember my warning. Don't make the same mistake I did. It's been 2 weeks since I attempted the ritual. The marks on my skin are brighter, almost glowing in the dark. My sleep is plagued by horrific nightmares, and I wake up every night covered in sweat, feeling their presence more intensely than ever. The men in black suits appear more frequently, not just in my home, but everywhere I go. They are always watching, always waiting. I began to notice changes in my surroundings. Electronics malfunctioned around me, lights flickered, and my phone and laptop acted like they had a mind of their own. One night, I found strange messages on my laptop that I hadn't written. They were cryptic warnings like, "The truth will consume you," and "You cannot hide from us." Desperation led me to reach out to a friend of mine, Sarah. She was an expert in paranormal activities and had always been fascinated by the unknown. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but I needed help, and she was my last hope. I called her, my voice trembling as I explained everything that had happened. "Nick, "You need to be very careful," she said, her voice filled with concern. "These entities, whatever they are, have a strong hold on you. I'll come over tonight and we'll figure this out together." When Sarah arrived, she brought a backpack filled with books, candles, crystals, and various herbs. She wasted no time and began setting up a protection circle in my living room. As she worked, she explained that she had encountered something similar before, but nothing this powerful. We sat inside the circle, surrounded by the soft glow of candles, and she began chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air grew heavy, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest. Suddenly, the humming noise returned, louder than ever. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. "Stay with me, Nick," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "We need to break their hold on you." As she chanted, the symbols on my skin began to burn, and I could feel them moving, like they were alive. The pain was excruciating, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the room went completely silent. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. I reached out, but she wasn't there. Panic set in as I stumbled in the dark, trying to find her. My hands brushed against cold metallic walls, and I realized I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was back in that nightmarish place, the metallic room with no doors or windows. The low hum was deafening now, vibrating through my entire body. The sickly gray figure appeared again, its black eyes staring into mine. "You cannot escape, Nick," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. "You belong to us." I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The figure reached out, its hand passing through my chest. I felt a cold, searing pain as it touched my heart. Images flooded my mind, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. I saw Earth, our world, being consumed by darkness, twisted and corrupted by the Keepers. "You will help us bring about the end," the figure said. "You are our harbinger." I wanted to scream, to fight, but I was powerless. The pain was unbearable, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. Just as I was about to lose hope, I heard Sarah's voice, faint and distant. "Nick, fight them," she screamed. "You have to fight." Her voice gave me the strength to push back. I focused on her words, on the memory of her face, and the pain began to recede. The figure's grip loosened, and I could move again. I lashed out, my fist passing through its body like it was made of smoke. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. "Impossible," it hissed. "You cannot defy us." Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to break free from its grasp. The metallic room began to dissolve, and I felt myself being pulled back into my apartment. The last thing I saw was the figure's eyes, filled with rage and fear. I woke up on the floor of my living room, the candle still burning, but Sarah was gone. The protection circle was intact, but there was no sign of her. I called out her name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Despair washed over me as I realized she had been taken. The Keepers had her now, and it was all my fault. I sat there surrounded by the remnants of our failed ritual, feeling more alone and terrified than ever. Days passed, and I received no word from Sarah. My attempts to contact her went unanswered. I was on my own, and the Keepers were growing more aggressive. The men in black suits appeared every night, their presence suffocating. They never spoke, just watched with those cold, emotionless eyes. I knew I had to find a way to rescue Sarah and break free from the Keeper's hold. But time was running out, and I could feel myself slipping further into their grasp. If anyone out there is reading this, please help me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. If they come for you, remember my warning. Don't make the same mistake I did. Stay away from the dark web. Stay away from the alien hacker group. Because once they have you, there's no escaping. And the truth they show you is more terrifying than you can imagine. If you don't hear from me again, you'll know why. And if you see the men in black suits, run. Run as fast as you can. I've reached my breaking point. The days blend into nights, each one filled with terror and dread. I can barely eat or sleep. The Keeper's hold on me grows stronger, and their influence is creeping into every aspect of my life. Sarah's disappearance haunts me, and the guilt is unbearable. I knew I had to do something, anything, to end this nightmare. Last night, I received another message on my laptop. It's time. It was different from the others, more ominous, more final. I knew I had to act. Desperation drove me to the only person who might be able to help, an old acquaintance named Jake, a former military tech specialist who had once dabbled in the paranormal. I drove to his place, every mile feeling like an eternity. When I arrived, Jake took one look at me and knew something was seriously wrong. I spilled everything about the Keepers, the men in black suits, Sarah, and the terrifying visions. Jake didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he listened intently, his face growing grimmer with each word. When I finished, he nodded and said, "I've heard whispers about these things. We're going to need a plan." Jake's place was a fortress. He had all kinds of tech gadgets, and he quickly set to work creating a makeshift Faraday cage to block any signals that might be coming in or out. We surrounded ourselves with protection symbols and loaded up on weapons, just in case. Jake had dealt with paranormal threats before, but he admitted that nothing had ever been this intense. As night fell, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The humming returned, louder than ever. Jake and I sat inside the Faraday cage, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The symbols on my skin burned, and I felt a strange energy pulsing through me. "It's starting," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "Stay calm and stay inside the circle." Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging us into darkness. The humming reached a deafening pitch, and a bright light filled the room. The Keepers appeared, their gray, sickly forms towering over us. Their black eyes were like endless voids, consuming everything. "You cannot escape," one of them said, its voice echoing in our minds. "You belong to us." Jake raised his weapon, but before he could fire, one of the Keepers reached out and disarmed him with a mere gesture. We were helpless, trapped in their grasp. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. "We won't let you take him," Jake shouted, his voice filled with defiance. The Keepers ignored him, their attention focused on me. "You have seen the truth, Nick. You will help us bring about the end." "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "I won't do it. I won't let you use me." The symbols on my skin burned hotter, and I felt a surge of pain. My vision blurred, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. Images of destruction, of worlds consumed by darkness, flooded my mind. I saw Sarah, her face twisted in agony, calling out for help. "Accept your fate," the Keeper said. "Become one with us." In that moment, something inside me snapped. The pain, the fear, the guilt. It all turned into rage. I felt a surge of energy, and the symbols on my skin began to glow brighter. I stood up, defiant, and faced the keepers. "No more!" I shouted. "I won't be your pawn." The energy pulsing through me intensified, and the room shook. The keepers recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting. I could feel their grip on me weakening. Jake took advantage of the moment, grabbing his weapon and firing at the keepers. The bullets passed through them, but it distracted them long enough for me to act. I reached out, focusing all my energy on the symbols. The pain was excruciating, but I pushed through it, chanting the words Sarah had used. The room filled with a blinding light, and the humming grew louder, almost unbearable. The keepers screamed, their voices a cacophony of rage and fear. Their forms dissolved, and the light intensified, engulfing everything. I felt myself being lifted, the energy coursing through me, tearing me apart and putting me back together. When the light finally faded, I was lying on the floor, gasping for breath. The room was quiet, the humming gone. The symbols on my skin were fading, the burning pain receding. I looked around and saw Jake, battered but alive, leaning against the wall. "We did it," he said, his voice weak but triumphant. "We sent them back." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. I knew the keepers weren't gone for good. They would return, and I needed to be ready. But for now, the immediate threat was over. I had a chance to reclaim my life, to find Sarah, and make things right. Jake helped me to my feet, and we started planning our next move. We knew the keepers would come back, but we were prepared. We would find others who had been marked, who had seen the truth, and together we would fight back. As I left Jake's place, I felt a strange sense of hope. The road ahead was long and filled with danger, but I wasn't alone. And for the first time in months, I felt like I had a fighting chance. If you're reading this, know that the keepers are real. They are out there, watching, waiting, but we can fight back. We can resist. Don't let them consume you. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and remember, you are not alone. And if they come for you, if you see the men in black suits, don't give in to the fear. Fight. Fight with everything you have. Because once they have you, there's no escaping. But together, we can stand against them. We can reclaim our lives. Stay safe and stay strong. I found my ex-girlfriend on Tinder on the dark web. Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be one to post something like this, but I really need to get this off my chest. A few weeks ago, I stumbled upon something that has left me completely shaken. I hope sharing it here might give me some peace of mind, or at least help me understand what the hell I saw. To give you some background, my ex-girlfriend Emily and I broke up about a year ago. It wasn't a messy breakup, just one of those things where we grew apart. We went our separate ways, and I haven't heard from her since. But then, a few weeks ago, I saw her on Tinder. Now, this wouldn't be strange in itself, but it's how I saw her that haunts me. I'm not proud of this, but I've always had a bit of a fascination with the dark web. It's that part of the internet that you know you shouldn't go to, but the curiosity sometimes gets the better of you. I visited a few forums and checked out some disturbing content, but I've always been careful, making sure to use a VPN and Tor to cover my tracks. One night, I came across a thread that mentioned a hidden Tinder service on the dark web. The idea seemed ridiculous. but my curiosity piqued, so I decided to check it out. After jumping through several hoops and navigating a maze of links, I found it. It was a grotesque parody of the real Tinder, with a layout that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. But it wasn't the design that unsettled me. It was the profiles. They were real people, but the way they were presented was beyond disturbing. Each profile had explicit, horrifying images and detailed descriptions that read more like a sick fantasy than a dating profile. And then I saw her. Emily's face popped up on my screen and my heart stopped. Her profile picture was a candid shot of her sitting in her favorite coffee shop, the one we used to go to all the time. She looked just like I remembered. Bright eyes, soft brown hair, that same smile. But it was the other pictures that made my blood run cold. They showed her in various states of undress, looking terrified and vulnerable. The most disturbing one had her tied up, a look of sheer terror on her face. It was a side of Emily I had never seen, and it was clear these photos weren't consensual. Her profile description was equally horrifying. It detailed intimate aspects of her life that only someone who knew her well could have written. It described her fears, her secrets, and things I knew she would never share willingly. Whoever created this profile had been watching her, studying her, and they knew things about her that I couldn't even fathom. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My first thought was to call her, to make sure she was okay. But when I tried to reach out, her number was disconnected. Panic set in as I realized I had no way of contacting her. I started digging through social media, mutual friends, anyone who might know where she was, but it was like she had vanished off the face of the earth. I spent hours on that twisted version of Tinder, going through every detail of her profile, looking for any clue that might help me find her. I even messaged the profile, hoping whoever was behind it might respond. To my surprise, they did. The message was short and cryptic, simply saying, "You're too late." Too late for what? The implications were horrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her. I knew I needed to find her, to make sure she was safe, but I had no idea where to start. I contacted the police, but they didn't take me seriously. They brushed it off as a sick joke or some elaborate prank, and without any concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. Desperation drove me back to the dark web. I started frequenting forums, asking questions, trying to find anyone who might know something about this twisted version of Tinder. I made contact with some pretty shady characters, but most of them either didn't know anything or demanded money for information. I was at a dead end. Then one night, I received a message from an anonymous user. It simply said, "I know where she is." Attached was a video file. With trembling hands, I opened it, and what I saw has haunted me every night since. The video showed Emily, alive but clearly in distress. She was in a dimly lit room, tied to a chair, with bruises and cuts covering her body. She was crying, begging for help, looking directly into the camera as if she could see me. There was a man's voice in the background, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at a black screen, my mind racing. I don't know what to do. I can't go to the police with this. They've already dismissed me once, but I can't just sit here and do nothing. Emily is out there somewhere, and she's in danger. I need to find her, but I'm terrified of what I might uncover. If anyone on here has any advice or knows anything about this dark web Tinder. Please help me. I can't do this alone. I've been spending every waking moment trying to piece together what happened to Emily. I know it's been a few days since my last update, but things have gotten a lot darker and more complicated. After watching that horrific video, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's face, her tear-streaked cheeks, and the fear in her eyes. I had to do something. I decided to reach out to that anonymous user who sent me the video. I sent them a message, pleading for more information. Hours felt like days as I waited for a response. Finally, another message came through. It said, "Follow the rabbit hole." Attached was a link. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the mouse, but I knew I had no choice. I clicked the link, and it took me to another dark web forum, one I hadn't seen before. This one was different. It wasn't just a discussion board, it was a marketplace, and what they were selling wasn't drugs or weapons, it was people. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the listings. Each one was a profile, like a twisted catalog of human lives. There were photos, descriptions, prices. I felt sick to my stomach. These were real people, being sold like commodities. And then I saw it. Emily's profile. Her listing had more photos, even more disturbing than the ones I saw before. There were also details about her age, height, weight, even her blood type. The description was chillingly specific, outlining her features and qualities like she was a piece of meat. The price for her was astronomical, but what really caught my eye was the location. It was an address, somewhere in a remote part of the city I wasn't familiar with. I jotted down the address and decided to investigate. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. I armed myself with a knife and some pepper spray. It felt pathetic, but it was better than nothing. I took a cab to the outskirts of the city, then walked the rest of the way, trying to avoid drawing any attention. The address led me to an old, abandoned warehouse. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but there were subtle signs of recent activity. Tire tracks in the dirt, a freshly broken window. I crept around the perimeter, looking for a way in. I found a side door that was slightly ajar and slipped inside. The interior was dark and musty, with a faint smell of decay. I could hear faint voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might give me away. I moved as quietly as I could, following the sound. I found a staircase leading down to a basement. The voices were clearer now, and I could make out fragments of a conversation. It was two men talking about the merchandise and tonight's auction. My blood ran cold. They were planning to sell Emily tonight. I crept closer, peering around a corner. There they were, two burly guys standing guard outside a heavy metal door. They looked like the kind of guys you wouldn't want to mess with. Thick necks, tattoos, and guns holstered at their hips. I knew I couldn't take them on directly. I needed a plan. As I was backing away, I accidentally knocked over a metal pipe. The clang echoed through the basement, and the guards immediately turned in my direction. I froze, my mind racing. They started towards me, their footsteps heavy on the concrete floor. I had no choice but to run. I bolted back up the stairs, my heart in my throat. I could hear them shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding up the stairs. I burst through the side door and sprinted into the night, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Eventually, I made it to a safe distance, and collapsed behind a dumpster, trying to catch my breath. I could still hear the guards shouting in the distance, but they didn't seem to be following me anymore. I knew I couldn't go back there alone. I needed help. I called a friend of mine, Jack, who used to be in the military. He was the only person I could think of who might be able to help me. When I told him what was going on, he didn't hesitate. He agreed to meet me at a nearby diner and bring some gear. We met up, and I explained everything in more detail. Jack didn't seem surprised by much. I guess he'd seen a lot during his time in the service. He nodded grimly as I told him about the auction and the warehouse. "We'll need more than just us," he said. "This sounds like a serious operation. We need to hit them hard and fast." Jack made a few calls, pulling in some favors from old military buddies. Within an hour, we had a small team ready to go. Armed to the teeth and prepared for a fight, we headed back to the warehouse. When we arrived, it was quiet. Too quiet. We moved in cautiously, spreading out to cover more ground. I led them to the basement, where the auction was supposed to take place. We moved silently, like shadows, down the stairs. As we approached the heavy metal door, I could hear muffled voices inside. Jack signaled for us to take positions. With a nod, we kicked in the door and stormed the room. What we found inside was worse than I could have imagined. It was a makeshift auction hall with a small stage and rows of chairs. There were a few people tied up on the stage, including Emily. She looked weak, her eyes barely open. The room erupted into chaos as we charged in, guns blazing. The guards didn't stand a chance. We took them down quickly and efficiently, securing the room. Jack and his team freed the captives, while I ran to Emily. She was barely conscious, but she was alive. I held her close, whispering that she was safe now, that everything was going to be okay. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. Whoever was behind this operation wouldn't just let it go. They would come looking for revenge. And I had a feeling this rabbit hole went much deeper than I could have ever imagined. I'll update you all again soon. I need to get Emily to a hospital and figure out our next move. Thank you for all the support and advice. We're going to need it. After the chaos of the raid, we managed to get Emily out of there and to a hospital. She was in bad shape, but the doctors assured me she would recover physically. Mentally, though, was another story. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was in broken, terrified whispers. It was clear she'd been through hell, and it would take a long time for her to heal from the trauma. While Emily was in the hospital, I stayed with her as much as I could. She was heavily sedated most of the time, but there were moments when she would wake up, panic-stricken, and it would take a while to calm her down. During one of those moments, she managed to tell me a bit about what had happened to her. She said she had been grabbed off the street one night after work, thrown into a van, and driven to that warehouse. They kept her locked up, drugged, and constantly monitored. They'd taken the photos and videos to advertise her. And there were always men coming in and out, inspecting her, like she was some kind of product. The things they did to her, I could barely stand to hear it. It was clear these people were part of something much larger and more sinister. While Emily was recovering, Jack and I started to dig deeper into the dark web. We needed to find out who was behind this operation and how far it went. Jack's military connections proved invaluable. He managed to get us in contact with someone who claimed to have insider knowledge about these kinds of human trafficking rings. The contact, a guy who went by the alias Crow, agreed to meet us in a seedy bar on the edge of town. Crow was a wiry, nervous-looking guy with a twitchy demeanor, but he seemed to know his stuff. He told us that these auctions were part of a much larger network, one that spanned multiple countries and involved some very powerful people. According to Crow, the warehouse we had raided was just a small operation, a local hub for a much larger trafficking ring. The real power was held by a group known as the Syndicate. They were the ones who organized the auctions, set the prices, and ensured the merchandise was delivered to the highest bidders. They had connections everywhere: law enforcement, government officials, even some high-profile businessmen. Crow warned us that by disrupting the auction, we had put ourselves on the Syndicate's radar. They would be looking for us, and they wouldn't stop until they had exacted their revenge. He gave us a name: Anton Volkov, the man he said was in charge of operations in our area. Finding Volkov, Crow said, would be our best chance at dismantling the local branch of the Syndicate and getting some answers. Armed with this new information, Jack and I started our hunt for Volkov. We spent days scouring the city, following leads, and talking to anyone who might know something. It was slow going, but we finally caught a break when a former associate of Volkov's agreed to meet with us. The meeting took place in a dilapidated apartment building, the kind where the walls are paper thin and the stench of decay lingers in the air. The associate, a man named Sergei, looked like he hadn't slept in days. He was jittery and paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. Sergei told us that Volkov operated out of an old mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was heavily guarded, and getting inside would be nearly impossible without inside help. But Sergei had a way in, a maintenance tunnel that ran under the property. He said he could get us inside, but it would be risky. Volkov was known for his brutality, and getting caught would mean certain death. We didn't have a choice. We needed to stop Volkov and the Syndicate. Emily's life and the lives of countless others depended on it. We spent the next few days planning our approach, gathering supplies, and preparing for the worst. The night of the raid, we met Sergei at the entrance to the maintenance tunnel. It was a narrow, filthy passage that smelled of sewage and rot. We crawled through the tunnel, the darkness closing in around us. The only light came from the faint glow of our flashlights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As we approached the end of the tunnel, Sergei signaled for us to stop. He whispered that the tunnel would open into the basement of the mansion, and from there, we would have to find our way to Volkov's office. He warned us again of the dangers, but we were resolute. We couldn't turn back now. We emerged from the tunnel into a dimly lit basement filled with crates and old furniture. The air was thick with dust, and every step we took seemed to echo through the empty space. We moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows as we made our way up the stairs and into the mansion. The mansion was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, each more opulent and sinister than the last. We encountered a few guards, but we managed to take them out silently, avoiding any alarms. Finally, we reached Volkov's office. The door was heavy and reinforced, but Sergei had given us a key. Inside, Volkov was sitting at a massive desk, a look of surprise quickly turning to rage as we burst in. He reached for a gun, but Jack was faster. He disarmed Volkov and pinned him to the ground. I stood over him, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. We interrogated Volkov, demanding to know everything about the Syndicate. He was defiant at first, But when Jack applied some pressure, both physically and psychologically, he began to talk. He confirmed what Crow had told us about the network and revealed that Emily's kidnapping was just one of many orchestrated by his organization. They had safe houses, connections, and resources far beyond what we had imagined. Volkov's confession was both a victory and a horror. We had the information we needed, but it also meant that our fight was far from over. The syndicate was vast and powerful, and taking down Volkov was just the beginning. We handed Volkov over to the authorities, along with the evidence we had gathered. The police, now with no choice but to take us seriously, launched a full-scale investigation into the syndicate. But as we left the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. Emily was safe for now, but there were countless others still trapped in that nightmare. The fight was far from over, and I knew that as long as the syndicate existed, none of us would ever truly be safe. I'll update you all as things develop. Thank you for your continued support. We're going to need it more than ever. The days following Volkov's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. The police raided the mansion, uncovering more evidence of the syndicate's operations. The media caught wind of the story, and it quickly became national news. But as much as the exposure helped shine a light on the horrors we'd uncovered, it also put us in even greater danger. I knew the syndicate wouldn't take this lying down. Volkov was just a cog in their massive machine, and with him gone, someone else would step up to take his place. Emily was still in the hospital, recovering physically, but mentally she was still trapped in her nightmare. I visited her every day, trying to offer what little comfort I could, but the fear in her eyes never faded. One evening, as I sat by her bedside, Emily finally spoke more coherently. Her voice was shaky, but she managed to tell me about a name she'd overheard during her captivity: the Architect. According to Emily, the Architect was the mastermind behind the syndicate's operations, the one who orchestrated everything from the shadows. No one knew his real identity, but everyone feared him. With this new lead, Jack and I decided to dig deeper. We needed to find the Architect and take him down if we were ever going to dismantle the syndicate for good. But finding someone who operated in the shadows was no easy task. We spent hours on the dark web, sifting through forums and message boards, looking for any mention of the Architect. It was during one of these late night sessions that we got a breakthrough. An anonymous user reached out to us, claiming to have information on the Architect. The message was brief and cryptic, but it included an address, a remote cabin in the woods, several hours' drive from the city. The user warned us that it would be heavily guarded and that the Architect was extremely dangerous. We didn't have any other leads, so we decided to take the risk. Jack gathered his team again, and we prepared for what we knew would be a deadly mission. We armed ourselves with everything we could: guns, body armor, and enough ammunition to start a small war. We knew we were walking into a trap, but we didn't have a choice. The drive to the cabin was tense. The further we got from the city, the more isolated the landscape became. Dense forests lined the winding roads, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the headlights. We finally reached the turnoff, a narrow dirt road that led deep into the woods. We killed the lights and proceeded cautiously, the tension in the car palpable. When we arrived, the cabin was barely visible through the trees. It was an old, decrepit structure, surrounded by a high fence and patrolled by armed guards. We parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, using the cover of darkness to our advantage. Jack signaled for us to spread out and take positions. We moved silently, like phantoms in the night, until we were close enough to see the guards clearly. Jack gave the signal, and we took them out swiftly and silently. One by one, they fell until the perimeter was secure. We regrouped at the cabin's entrance. The door was reinforced, just like at Volkov's mansion, but Jack had brought along some explosives for just this kind of situation. With a muffled explosion, the door was blown off its hinges, and we stormed inside. The interior was as decrepit as the exterior. The air was thick with dust and mold, and the wooden floorboards creaked under our weight. We moved through the rooms, clearing them one by one until we reached the basement door. The door was ajar, and faint light seeped through the cracks. As we descended into the basement, the smell of decay grew stronger. The basement was a large open space filled with old furniture and strange makeshift equipment. In the center of the room was a man bound to a chair, his face battered and bruised. He looked up as we entered, a mix of fear and relief in his eyes. "Are you the architect?" Jack demanded, aiming his gun at the man. The man shook his head weakly. "No, they call him that, but it's not me. Please, you have to believe me." Before we could question him further, a trapdoor in the floor burst open, and armed men poured into the room. We were caught off guard, and a fierce gunfight erupted. Bullets flew, and the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. We took cover behind whatever we could find, returning fire with everything we had. The firefight seemed to last forever, but eventually we managed to take down the attackers. The room fell silent, except for the moans of the injured. Jack and I approached the bound man again, his face now pale and covered in sweat. "Who is the architect?" I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. The man coughed, blood trickling from his mouth. He's closer than you think. Always watching, always one step ahead. You'll never find him. He'll find you." With those final, cryptic words, the man slumped forward, unconscious. We had come so far, only to hit another dead end, but his words echoed in my mind. The architect was always one step ahead, always watching. It meant he knew about us, knew what we were trying to do. We left the cabin, our minds racing. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. We had stirred the hornet's nest, and now the syndicate was aware of us. We needed to regroup, rethink our strategy, and prepare for whatever came next. As we drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to move, and every noise made me jump. We were dealing with a monster far more dangerous and cunning than we had ever imagined, and I knew, deep down, that the real nightmare was only just beginning. I'll keep you updated as we uncover more. We need all the help we can get. This fight is far from over. The ride back to the city was silent. The gravity of our situation was sinking in. The architect knew about us, and it was only a matter of time before he made his move. We had to stay ahead, but the fear of the unknown was crushing. Jack and I needed a new plan, and fast. Once we were back, we reconvened at Jack's safe house, a nondescript apartment he used for situations like this. We secured the place, triple-checking locks, and setting up surveillance. We couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. As we settled in, Emily called. Her voice was still weak, but she managed to tell me something crucial. She remembered where she had heard about the architect before. During her captivity, she overheard a conversation between two guards about a meeting place. They mentioned an old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of the city. It was a place notorious for its dark history, a fitting hideout for someone like the architect. With this lead, we decided it was time to go on the offensive. We gathered our team, the same group of former military buddies Jack had called in before. Each of them knew the risks, but they were determined to see this through. We loaded up our gear and headed for the asylum, moving under the cover of darkness. The asylum was a massive, decaying structure, its silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. We approached cautiously, our senses heightened by the eerie silence that surrounded the place. The front entrance was sealed, but Jack found a side window that had been pried open. We slipped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was a maze of crumbling walls and debris-strewn floors. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. We moved silently, communicating through hand signals. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. As we navigated the dark corridors, we found signs of recent activity: discarded food wrappers, cigarette butts, and fresh footprints in the dust. We followed the footprints deeper into the asylum, down into the basement, where the air grew colder and the walls closed in around us. The basement was a warren of narrow hallways and small claustrophobic rooms. We could hear faint voices ahead, and the glow of a light seeped through the cracks of a door at the end of the hall. We approached the door, weapons ready. Jack signaled for us to stack up, and with a nod, we breached the room. Inside, we found a group of men huddled around a table, deep in discussion. They looked up in shock as we stormed in, but we were on them before they could react. We subdued them quickly, securing the room. One of the men, a weaselly-looking guy with a nervous tic, seemed to be the leader. We interrogated him, demanding to know the architect's whereabouts. He was defiant at first, but when Jack pressed a gun to his temple, he started to talk. He revealed that the architect had a hidden office in the asylum, accessible through a secret passage. With our prisoner guiding us, we found the hidden passage behind a false wall. It led to a small, well-furnished office, completely at odds with the rest of the decrepit building. The office was filled with computers, surveillance equipment, and documents detailing the syndicate's operations. But what caught our attention was a large monitor displaying live feeds from various locations, including the hospital where Emily was staying. The architect was watching us. He had been one step ahead the whole time. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized Emily was still in danger. I grabbed a laptop from the desk and started downloading all the information I could. We needed to get this evidence to the authorities, but first, we had to make sure Emily was safe. We rushed back to the hospital, fear gripping me with every passing second. When we arrived, the place was eerily quiet. We found Emily's room, but she was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled. Panic set in as I searched the room for any clue, any sign of where she might have been taken. Jack's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The message was simple: "Come to the roof if you want to see her alive." We raced to the rooftop, our hearts pounding. The door to the roof was ajar, and we stepped out into the cool night air. There, standing at the edge, was the architect. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in black, with Emily held in front of him, a knife pressed to her throat. "Let her go," I shouted, my voice shaking with rage. The architect smiled coldly. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long. It's time to end this." Jack and I inched forward, weapons drawn, but the architect tightened his grip on Emily. One more step, and she dies. The tension was unbearable. I couldn't lose Emily again. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. Suddenly, Emily twisted in his grip, catching him off guard. In that split second, Jack fired, hitting the architect in the shoulder. He staggered, dropping the knife, and Emily broke free. I ran to her, pulling her into my arms. The architect was down, but not out. He lunged for his weapon, but Jack was faster. He put a bullet through the architect's head, ending it once and for all. The police arrived moments later, and we handed over all the evidence we had gathered. The syndicate was far from dismantled, but we had taken out one of its key players. Emily was safe, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Emily and I spent the next few days recovering and trying to process everything that had happened. The media frenzy eventually died down, and the police continued their investigation into the syndicate. Jack and his team went back to their lives, but we knew we would always be connected by this experience. Emily and I decided to move away, start fresh somewhere new. The memories of what had happened would always haunt us, but we were determined to build a new life together, far from the shadows of the syndicate. As we drove away from the city, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The syndicate was still out there, and the architect's warning echoed in my mind. My friend went missing because of the dark web. My parents have some explanation to do. It all started about a month ago when my friend Jacob vanished. We were always messing around with tech stuff, hacking into things for fun, and that naturally led us to explore the dark web. We were just a couple of bored teenagers in a small town, looking for thrills. But now, I wish we had never gone down that path. Jacob was the kind of guy who'd try anything once, and he got pretty deep into the dark web. He started finding these obscure forums and chat rooms, the kind that gave you a sick feeling just reading the titles. I didn't know half of what he was doing until he showed me some of the things he had found: illegal auctions, hitman services, and even more disturbing stuff involving children and torture. It was sickening, but Jacob seemed morbidly fascinated. One night Jacob messaged me around 2 a.m. He said he had found something huge, something we needed to see in person. He came over to my house, his eyes wide with excitement and fear. He wouldn't tell me much, just that it was some kind of live stream. I was hesitant, but my curiosity got the better of me. He went into my basement, set up his laptop, and connected to this sketchy, encrypted site. It was like a regular streaming site, but darker, more sinister. The screen flickered to life, and what we saw made my blood run cold. There was a man, tied to a chair in a dark room, bruised and bloody. A distorted voice started speaking, giving orders to an unseen person. They were torturing the man on camera, asking the viewers for instructions. Jacob seemed entranced, but I was horrified. The voice on the stream mentioned something about sending a message. Before I could process what was happening, the man on the screen screamed in agony as his fingers were cut off one by one. I yelled at Jacob to turn it off, but he just sat there, watching. Finally, I slammed the laptop shut, and we sat in silence, both shaking. Jacob left soon after, saying he needed to find out more. I told him he was crazy, that we needed to report this, but he wouldn't listen. The next day, Jacob didn't show up for school. His parents called mine, asking if I knew where he was. I lied, saying I hadn't seen him since the day before. I was too scared to admit the truth. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Jacob. His parents were frantic. The police were useless, and I was living in constant fear. Then weird things started happening. I started getting anonymous emails with links to more dark websites. At first, I ignored them, but the curiosity and fear gnawed at me. I finally clicked on one, and it was another live stream. This time, the room was empty except for a chair and a table with a knife on it. The same distorted voice came on, saying, "Welcome back, Jacob's friend. We see you." I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. They knew who I was. They were watching me. I unplugged my computer, but it didn't stop there. My phone started ringing at odd hours, and when I answered, there was only silence. At night, I felt like I was being watched, even though my parents assured me it was all in my head. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. One night, I woke up to the sound of my window creaking open. My heart pounded as I saw a shadow slip into my room. I screamed, and the figure lunged at me, covering my mouth. I recognized the face. It was Jacob, but he looked different. His eyes were wild, and he was filthy, like he hadn't seen the sun in weeks. He whispered, "They have me, but I escaped. They're coming for you too." He let go of me and ran, disappearing into the night. I tried to follow, but he was gone. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me, saying it was a bad dream. I started to piece things together. Jacob's obsession with the dark web, his disappearance, the live streams. It was all connected. The final straw was when I found a note in my room, written in Jacob's handwriting. "They're watching your parents too." I confronted my parents, demanding to know what was going on. They exchanged a look of fear and guilt before my dad finally spoke. "There's something you need to know about our family. Something we hoped you would never find out." My dad's confession hit me like a ton of bricks. I sat down, my legs suddenly feeling too weak to hold me up. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. My mom looked at my dad, her eyes pleading silently for him to stop, but he just shook his head and continued. "Years ago, before you were born, your mother and I got involved in some questionable activities on the dark web. It was a different time, and we were young and stupid. We found ourselves in deep with a group that called themselves the Collective. They were into some really dark stuff. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What kind of stuff? I asked, dreading the answer. Human trafficking, illegal experiments, torture for entertainment. You name it, they did it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We thought we could handle it, but when we tried to leave, they threatened us. We did some things we're not proud of to protect ourselves. We thought we were safe, but it looks like they're back. My mom finally spoke, tears streaming down her face. When Jacob got involved, we tried to warn him, but he didn't listen. They must have taken him to send us a message. The room spun as I tried to process everything. My parents were involved in this nightmare, and now Jacob was paying the price. So what do we do now? I asked, my voice trembling. We need to find the Collective and stop them, my dad said, his voice firm. We have to save Jacob, and we have to protect you. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. My parents started making calls, contacting old associates who might still have connections. They wouldn't tell me much, just that it was dangerous, and I needed to stay out of it. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I needed to find Jacob. One night, while my parents were out, I decided to go back into the dark web. I used an old laptop my dad had hidden in the attic, hoping it wouldn't be traced back to me. I navigated through the layers of encryption and found the same site where we had seen the live stream. My heart pounded as I logged in, praying I wouldn't see anything too horrific. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, another live stream. This time, the room was different. It was more like a dungeon, with stone walls and dim lighting. In the center of the room was Jacob, chained to the wall. He looked even worse than before. His clothes were torn, his face was bruised, and his eyes were hollow. The same distorted voice echoed through the speakers. "Welcome back. We see you found us again. Your friend has been very uncooperative." I typed furiously in the chat box, demanding to know what they wanted. The response was immediate and chilling. "Come to us, and we will release him. Fail to do so, and he will suffer the consequences." A set of coordinates appeared on the screen, followed by a countdown timer. I had 24 hours to decide. I knew it was a trap, but I couldn't just abandon Jacob. I scribbled down the coordinates and shut the laptop, my mind racing. When my parents came home, I confronted them with the information. They were furious that I had gone behind their backs, but they understood. "We're coming with you," my dad said. "We can't let you go alone." The next day, we drove out to the location, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the town. The place reeked of decay and neglect, a fitting lair for the collective. As we approached the building, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the door was a symbol I had seen before, an eye with a jagged scar through it. The same symbol that had appeared in the background of the live streams. We crept inside, the floorboards creaking under our feet. The place was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more ominous than the last. Finally, we found the room from the live streams. Jacob was there, chained to the wall, his eyes wide with fear and relief when he saw us. But before we could reach him, the door slammed shut behind us. The distorted voice echoed through the room. "Welcome to the end. Let's see how much you care for your friend." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and figures emerged from the shadows, masked and armed. My dad lunged at them, but he was quickly overpowered. My mom screamed as they dragged us all into the center of the room. One of the masked figures stepped forward, removing his mask to reveal a scarred, twisted face. "It's been a long time," he sneered, looking directly at my parents. "You thought you could escape us, but you were wrong." The scarred man's presence filled the room with a palpable dread. My parents' faces went pale, and I realized they knew him. This was personal. "Elias," my father whispered, his voice trembling. "Did you really think you could leave the collective without consequences?" Elias hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "We gave you everything, and you turned your backs on us. Now, you'll pay." Elias snapped his fingers, and the masked figures moved in, separating us. They dragged my parents to one side of the room, and me to the other, while Jacob remained chained to the wall, too weak to even lift his head. "What do you want?" I shouted, struggling against the rough hands holding me. "We'll do anything. Just let us go." Elias laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "What I want is retribution. Your parents' betrayal cost us dearly. Now you'll all suffer the consequences. Two of the masked figures pulled out cameras, pointing them at us. Elias stepped back, his eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. It's time to put on a show for our loyal viewers. The live stream had started. I could see the comments flooding in on a monitor mounted on the wall. People were egging them on, demanding more pain, more blood. My stomach churned at the thought of how many people found joy in our suffering. Elias turned to my parents. Let's start with a little family bonding exercise. Choose one, your son or your friend. One of them will go free, and the other will stay. My mother sobbed, shaking her head. No, please, don't make us choose. Elias's expression hardened. Choose, or they both die. My parents exchanged a pained look. My father's eyes met mine, filled with regret and fear. We're so sorry, he whispered. Choose, Elias roared, slamming his fist into the wall. Take me, I shouted, my voice breaking. Let Jacob go. Elias smiled, a cruel, satisfied grin. Very noble, but it's not your choice to make. He turned back to my parents. Well, my mom's sobs grew louder. My dad finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Let our son go. Take Jacob. My heart shattered at his words. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jacob had been my best friend, and now they were condemning him to a fate worse than death. Jacob's head lifted slightly, his eyes meeting mine with a look of resignation. Elias clapped his hands. Excellent choice, but I think I'll change the rules a bit. We'll start with the parents. The masked figures moved quickly, restraining my parents in chairs that faced the cameras. Elias walked over to a table filled with various tools, picking up a scalpel and examining it with a twisted fascination. Let's begin, he said, turning towards my mom. Shall we? I screamed and thrashed against my captors, but they held me firmly in place. Elias moved with a surgeon's precision, slicing into my mother's arm. Her screams echoed through the room, blending with my own. Blood flowed freely, pooling on the floor. The comments on the live stream grew more frenzied, urging Elias on. Next, he turned to my father. Your turn, he said almost gleefully. No, stop, I yelled, tears streaming down my face. Please, I'll do anything. Elias paused, considering my words. Anything, you say? Yes, I sobbed. Just let them go. He nodded to the masked figures, and they released my parents. They collapsed to the floor, too weak to move. Elias approached me, his face inches from mine. You have spirit. I like that. Very well. We'll play a new game. He gestured to Jacob, still chained to the wall. We're going to see how much pain you can endure. For every minute you lost, we'll loosen Jacob's chains. But if you pass out or beg us to stop, the deal is off. Understand? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Elias grinned and signaled the figures. They dragged me to the center of the room, tying me to a chair. Elias picked up a cattle prod, the electric hum filling the room with a sickening buzz. Ready? He asked, a manic glint in his eyes. I braced myself, clenching my teeth as the first jolt of electricity hit me. Pain exploded through my body, every nerve ending on fire. I bit down on my lip, tasting blood, determined not to give him the satisfaction of hearing me scream. Time lost all meaning as the torture continued. I felt my consciousness slipping, the edges of my vision darkening. But every time I thought I couldn't take any more, I forced myself to think of Jacob, of my parents, and somehow I found the strength to keep going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elias stepped back, lowering the prod. Impressive, he said almost grudgingly. You've earned your reward. The masked figures moved to Jacob, loosening his chains as promised. He fell to the ground, too weak to stand, but he was free. Elias turned to the cameras, addressing the viewers. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes tonight's show. Until next time. The cameras shut off, and the room plunged into darkness. The figures began to leave, one by one, until only Elias remained. He knelt down beside me, his voice low and menacing. You've bought them some time, but this isn't over. We'll be watching, always. With that, he stood and walked out, leaving us in the dark, broken and terrified. We had survived, but at what cost? And how long before the collective came for us again? After Elias and his masked cronies left, the silence in the room was deafening. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid scent of burnt flesh. I could hear my parents' labored breathing and Jacob's weak, pitiful whimpers. Every fiber of my being was screaming in agony, but we had to move. We had to get out. Mom, Dad, are you okay? I managed to croak out, my voice barely more than a whisper. We're here, son, my dad replied, though his voice was frail. We need to get Jacob and get out of this place. With immense effort, we untied each other. Jacob was barely conscious, his body limp and unresponsive. My dad and I half carried, half dragged him out of the room. My mom, though wounded, kept watch for any signs of movement from the collective. The corridors of the warehouse seemed endless, each one darker and more foreboding than the last. My legs felt like lead, but the thought of staying in that nightmare any longer pushed me forward. We stumbled upon a side exit, and with a final burst of energy, we pushed through the heavy doors into the night. The fresh air was a stark contrast to the stifling horror inside the warehouse. We didn't stop though. We kept moving, our adrenaline the only thing keeping us on our feet. We found our car parked in the shadows where we'd left it, and we piled in, my dad taking the wheel. Where do we go now? My mom asked, her voice trembling. Anywhere but here, my dad replied, starting the engine. We need to disappear. As we sped away from the warehouse, I looked back, half expecting to see Elias and his goons chasing us. But there was nothing but darkness. My body ached. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. But we were alive. We drove for hours, finally stopping at a dingy motel on the outskirts of a town I didn't recognize. My dad checked us in under a fake name, and we slipped into our room unnoticed. The relief of safety, however temporary, washed over me, and I collapsed onto the bed. The next few days were a blur. We tended to our wounds, tried to make sense of what had happened, and planned our next move. Jacob was the worst off. His physical and mental state was fragile, and he spoke in disjointed sentences about what they had done to him. His once bright eyes were now hollow, haunted by unseen horrors. One night, as we sat in our motel room, my dad finally spoke up. We can't keep running forever. We need to fight back. How? I asked, exhaustion and fear creeping into my voice. We have to expose the collective. Show the world what they're doing, he said, a determined look in his eyes. They thrive on secrecy and fear. If we take that away, we might stand a chance. It sounded insane, but we were desperate. We started gathering everything we had, videos, notes, anything that could prove the collective's existence. I hacked into Jacob's accounts, finding old conversations, hidden files, and more disturbing evidence of the collective's operations. Each discovery was more horrifying than the last, but it fueled our resolve. my dad reached out to an old contact, a journalist who had once been a friend before my parents went underground. He agreed to meet us in a secluded location, promising to bring everything to light. It felt like our last hope. We drove to the meeting place, a remote cabin deep in the woods. The isolation was both comforting and terrifying. We were away from prying eyes, but also far from any help if things went south. The journalist Mark arrived late at night, carrying a laptop and a notepad. "Show me what you've got," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his shock at our appearance. We laid everything out for him: videos of the live streams, recordings of the distorted voice, documents detailing transactions and operations. Mark's face grew grimmer with each piece of evidence. This is unbelievable," he muttered. "If this gets out, it'll blow everything wide open, but it's dangerous. They won't let this go easily." "We know," my dad said, his voice resolute, "but it's the only way to stop them." Mark nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he compiled the evidence. "I'll get this out as soon as possible. We'll need to stay off the grid for a while, though. They'll come after all of us." The next morning, we parted ways with Mark, hoping he could do what we couldn't. The waiting was excruciating. We stayed in the cabin, the tension making every creak of the wood sound like footsteps, every rustle of the leaves a threat. 3 days later, the story broke. It was everywhere: news sites, social media, even the local news. "Dark web nightmare, the collective exposed," the headline screamed. It was a small victory, but we knew it was far from over. That night, as we huddled in the cabin, the power went out. Panic set in immediately. We grabbed what we could, preparing to flee, but it was too late. The door burst open, and masked figures flooded in. Elias stood at the forefront, his face twisted in rage. "You thought you could expose us and get away with it?" he spat, advancing on us. I felt my heart sink. We had been so close, but as Elias approached, a new resolve filled me. "You'll never win," I said, my voice steady. "People know about you now. They'll come for you." Elias laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Maybe, but tonight you'll suffer for your defiance." Elias's laughter echoed through the cabin, chilling me to the bone. The masked figures fanned out, their eyes cold and unfeeling behind their masks. My parents and Jacob huddled close to me, our backs against the wall. There was nowhere to run. Elias stepped forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You're right. People know about us now, but that won't save you tonight." In a flash, my dad lunged at Elias, desperation fueling his attack. Elias sidestepped, delivering a swift, brutal kick to my dad's stomach. He collapsed, gasping for air. My mom screamed, and I felt a surge of anger and fear. Suddenly, the cabin was filled with the sound of engines and the flash of headlights. The front door burst open, and armed men in tactical gear stormed in, shouting commands. "FBI, get down on the ground." Chaos erupted. The masked figures fought back, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Elias tried to escape, but he was tackled to the ground, his face smashing into the floorboards. The agents swarmed over him, cuffing him and the remaining members of the collective. In the midst of the confusion, Mark appeared, his face grim but relieved. "We tracked them here," he explained. "After the story broke, the FBI took it seriously. They've been hunting these bastards for years." I could barely process what was happening. Relief, fear, and exhaustion crashed over me in waves. We were safe for now, but the trauma of what we had endured was far from over. The FBI agents escorted us out of the cabin, shielding us from the glares and curses of the collective members being led away in cuffs. Outside, the dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the forest. The nightmare was ending, but the scars would remain. We were taken to a safe house, where doctors tended to our wounds and agents debriefed us on everything that had happened. It felt surreal, like a terrible dream we couldn't wake from. Jacob was admitted to a hospital, his condition critical but stable. My parents and I stayed together, clinging to the fragile sense of security. Over the next few days, the full extent of the collective's operations came to light. The FBI dismantled their network, arresting members across the country. The story dominated the news, a horrifying glimpse into the dark web's underworld. But for us, the healing process was just beginning. We were offered new identities, a chance to start over. It was a daunting prospect, leaving everything behind, but we knew it was our best shot at a normal life. One evening, as we prepared to leave for our new home, Mark visited us one last time. "You're brave, all of you," he said. "You exposed something truly evil. The world is safer because of you." I nodded, trying to muster a smile. "Thank you for everything." Mark shook my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Take care of yourselves, and remember, they're watching out for you now. You're not alone." As we drove away from the safe house, I looked out the window, watching the landscape blur into an unfamiliar new beginning. We had lost so much, endured unimaginable horrors, but we had survived, and in the end, we had taken a stand against the darkness. The memories of that night would haunt me forever. The screams, the blood, the relentless fear. But we had fought back, and we had won. The collective was broken, and we were free. In the quiet moments, I still think of Jacob, of the pain he endured because of us. I hope he finds peace as we try to rebuild our lives. The dark web had shown us its worst, but we had faced it and emerged stronger. Our new life awaited, a fragile hope on the horizon. We were survivors, united by our ordeal, and together we would heal. The shadow of the collective might linger, but it would no longer control us. We had reclaimed our lives, and that was a victory worth fighting for.